right. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Jennifer Rubin. I'm the Vice President of Partnerships and Special Projects for the American Society of the University of Haifa. Today, we will be discussing the psychological and physiological impacts of COVID-19 on elections. There are innumerous stressors and yet undetermined factors as a result of the pandemic that are impacting all aspects of life, including how we filter information and make important decisions. There's a lot to unpack with what some of these implications might mean for voter behavior and the longer term effects of the upcoming US election. We are very fortunate to have Dr. Waismel-Manor and Dr. Waismel-Manor with us to help sort it all out. Dr. Waismel-Manor is Professor Emeritus of Clinical Psychology in the School of Social Work at University of Haifa and an expert in psychological stress. He's the former president of both the European Society for Trauma and Dissociation and the International Society for the Study of Trauma and Dissociation, as well as the founder of Trauma and Dissociation Israel. Dr. Waismel-Manor was twice selected in the Marriage Survey as one of the 10 best clinical psychologists in Israel. Dr. Israel Waismel-Manor is the chair of the Government and Political Theory Department in the School of Political Science at University of Haifa. His research focuses on political attitude formation and its effects on voting behavior. He's currently exploring the ways in which nonverbal communication, physiological stress, institutional settings, and new media influence political preferences and behavior. We're also joined by Jake Sharfman, our partner, colleague, and founding member of J-Cubed PR, who will be moderating. Jake, I'm going to turn things over to you.
Thank you so much, Jen, and thanks to all our guests tuning in from around the world, and of course, a big thank you to Dr. Waismel-Manor and Dr. Waismel-Manor. We will be opening up the conversation to questions from the audience at the end, which you can submit using the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and we'll hope to get to all the questions that we have time for. So, Dr. Waismel-Manor, we'll start with some questions for you. Off the bat, we're approaching 8 months now since the World Health Organization declared COVID-19 a public health emergency of international concern. Can you explain how the psychological effects of COVID-19 have become such an integral part of our lives and any additional implications this may have over an even more extended period of time?
Well, as we discussed before we started this webinar, these are absolutely extraordinary times that call for extensive, immediate, ongoing stress research, and we are indeed engaged in such research. What I would say first in response to your question is that we all operate, when we are mentally well, under some basic assumptions that everything is going to be okay. These kind of basic assumptions allow us to disregard or deny in a healthy way all the many possible threats that are facing us. Diseases, car accidents, we can all get hurt at any time, but we don't think about it when we are well and not anxious. Currently, the basic premise of safety that is associated with regular socializing and normal life, the basic premise, the basic assumption of safety is being violated. And when basic assumptions of safety are violated, and when people can no longer assume that everything is going to be okay, anxiety develops. So now the basic assumptions must be someone might get hurt or suffer some unwanted consequence, might get hurt economically or health-wise. And indeed, the published research that is coming out very quickly on mental health under COVID shows exactly that. People are also deprived of their leisure and cultural activities. We can no longer go to museums, to concerts, to the opera, to restaurants, to fitness centers. We can no longer travel normally, stay in hotels. All these are restricting our lives for 8 months now. And this causes elevated boredom and depression. And the isolation causes stimulus deprivation, or what you would call in America, in North America, cabin fever. So social isolation and stimulus deprivation also promotes depression. And we see that. The data that we are collecting already shows that. There's also forced intimacy. People need to live for a prolonged period of times in close quarters with partners, with family members that we normally see only for a few hours or even less than that per day. This forced intimacy can put potential strain on relationships, and we do see an increase in domestic violence and divorce. And there are many other impacts. I will not cover them all, but the university studies are not normal, and I don't know how it will impact the quality of future education. And of course, the economic hardships. People are losing their jobs, people are going bankrupt. This has devastating impact on mental health.
Mm-hmm. Governments around the world, they're starting to increase restrictions again as COVID cases continue to rise. Israel being, the prime example of that, what appears to be going into a full country lockdown starting tomorrow, Friday. What are the psychological obstacles and considerations for people as we go from lockdown to reintegration and now back to what seems like retransitioning into again a more restricted way of life as we know it?
Well, the tightening of restrictions and the second full lockdown that we are entering here in Israel is, of course, an obvious infringement on our personal freedom, and that will create predictable stress. The main problem, to my mind, with the changing regulations and decrees is that it creates confusion. It creates further attrition of public morale, and it creates erosion of public trust in the leadership. What we're witnessing in both our respective countries, the United States and Israel, to my mind, is a chaotic management of this strategic threat, and these frequently changing and sometimes contradicting policies that we see, and ineffective or an absent enforcement of these policies. Disagreements among and between politicians and epidemiologists about the optimal course of action. All this raises doubts about the validity of any imposed restriction. And the inevitable outcome could be compromised compliance or non-compliance, as indeed we do see in both countries. So, but let me tie this with the political situation. Our respective countries are led by two embattled leaders who seem, at least to me as an onlooker, to mismanage the crisis. One is indicted with 3 criminal accusations in our country. The other is facing elections with poor approval rating and polls that seem to favor his opponent. So they both must deny the gravity of the crisis unfolding on their watch, and both indeed do it by gaslighting. Now, what is gaslighting? Gaslighting is a typical rhetoric used by perpetrators, and that's my field of expertise, when they've been accused of bad behavior. I'm borrowing again from my area of clinical psychology. So let me briefly describe this rhetorical strategy that characterizes abusive people. First, they would deny that the situation is serious and that they have mismanaged it or misbehaved. I never said that. I did not order this. We are doing well compared to others. The deny stage is where gaslighting starts to come into play with a person often trying to simply deny someone else's lived reality. No, these numbers are inflated. We're actually doing better. The poor have been the least affected by this economic crisis. This is something a Knesset member said today. Or some of our hospitals might be overburdened, but our situation is not as bad as it is elsewhere. So we're doing fairly well. Then there is the attack bit. This is when the accused abuser turns around the criticism to focus blame on those calling them out, or some other scapegoat, the radical left, China, you name it. So a leader called out by someone on Twitter, in the parliament, or during a demonstration, he then goes into attack mode by accusing the protesters of being liars, being politically motivated, or bitter and jealous, and proceeds by offering alternative facts. And finally, the gaslighting is characterized by reverse victim and offender. This is where things get sneaky and subtle. Suddenly, the accused person will turn things around and say, actually, they're not guilty of doing something terrible. In fact, they are the ones being treated poorly. It is the protesters who are spreading the virus. It is the complainers who demoralize the nation by spreading false news because of some dark motives. It is at that point that the conspiracy theories can be introduced. And in this stage, you might see someone introduce their own alleged trauma as an excuse or a distraction tactics. They'll respond to accusation of racism, for example, by telling a story about how they, their ancestors, or their family members have faced discrimination, or how they are being mistreated currently by the fake news media or by their opponents. Or they might focus on how they feel bullied by the accusations, so those listening to them might actually feel some empathy. So, and another strategy that I suggest the viewers should follow is the tendency at this point also to blame a scapegoat and rallying the voters against a third party, a made-up enemy, which reminds me 80 years ago that happened to us, the Jewish people. Nowadays, it can be the Chinese who have sent us the China virus, or the leftist anarchists who want to topple the democratically elected prime minister by spreading the disease because the chaos serves them well. This is also something that was mentioned this morning by Knesset members from the right here. The acronym of this mode of rhetoric is called DARVO, deny, attack, reverse victim and offender, and is the work of a colleague of mine in the United States, Jennifer Fry. So that's a long answer to a short question, sorry.
That's okay, it's insightful. The nature of the pandemic, it can be stressful no matter where you are and who you are. But in the US, I feel like it's a nation that's maneuvering additional COVID, non-COVID charged political and social issues. I mean, how might COVID impact the mental health and the decision-making of American citizens as we lead up to this to this US election on November 3?
Well, you're asking me here a question that's a little bit out of my field of expertise, but under economic and mortal threat like we are under, in an environment that is characterized by anomaly, by confusion, by chaos, people need decent, trustworthy leadership to provide them with hope. And also to point where there's chaos, people need a leader, a parental figure, if you will, to point to the way out of the crisis. So it is a short, I said parental figure because you can sense the clinical psychologist in me. It is a sort of a regress state that we're all in. We are anxious, we're threatened, and we don't understand what is the best protection. The rules have changed. It's a changed world. What coping policy is the best to be employed? We don't know. So we naturally turn to the authority figures, to our leaders. But what happens when the leaders seem unreliable? For example, by contradicting policies laid out by scientific advisors that they have appointed, or by showing no exemplary role model behaviors advocated by their own top experts. For example, that by not wearing masks or not keeping a social distance. What happens then? The result, to my mind, is again an inevitable damage to national morale and to the mental health of so many. So what would the impact on voters' opinion be in the face of this kind of leadership? It's difficult to tell. People react differently to populist leaders and to their propaganda. And many potential voters can see through the rhetoric, I think, and identify the persuading messages for what they are, but others can be swayed by populist leaders' charisma, by the simplistic sound bites that portray complex situations, a battle of good versus evil. So I think it is difficult to predict. People will, as the United States president says, we'll see. We'll wait and see.
Yeah.
To my mind, the base will tend to stay loyal, but we see a trend like Republicans for Joe Biden's or the new Likudniks. We see some shifting going on. But your guess is as good as mine.
Yeah. I want to expand just on one thing that you mentioned, was hope. And I think that over these 8 months of the pandemic, early on at this pandemic, people had, while everyone was scared, of course, there was a sense of hope that, perhaps by summertime with the warm weather, it'll be over, or the virus may run its course in a month or 2 or 3 or what have you. 8 months in, it's hard to find in Israel. I mean, I think in the US, when related to COVID, it's hard to find that hope. How important is that for the general psyche of people, where it seems like at this point, we don't know when we're going to get back to normal?
Yes, we don't. And when there's anomaly and we can't predict the future and we cannot rely on leadership, the risk is for anarchy. And we see these kind of trends of protesters willing to violate the decrees imposed by the government and take the law into their own hands. We've seen that in the United States. I'm afraid this could happen here as well. And both leaders in our respective countries try to provide some form of hope. Here in Israel, it is by signing these peace accords with the Gulf states. It has nothing to do with the situation, but it can provide some kind of a silver lining. In the United States, Trump has promised a vaccine, I think by November. However, the scientists maintain that an evidence-based, FDA-approved, mass-produced, commercially available vaccine will not happen before late in 2021. So I think Trump wants to be a cheerleader for the country. He's been quoted for saying that. But personally, I'm biased towards the scientists. And
Dr. Zomer, it looks like might have some technical issues with Dr. Zomer. Maybe we can just give, oh, there you're back. Sorry, you paused for a minute, Dr. Zomer.
Yeah.
So just moving on basically from what you did say about a vaccine and President Trump maybe referring or inferring that it could be available even by the election. How much could the existence or the promise of a vaccine by November 1st influence this mental outlook? And could it significantly affect public opinion?
I doubt it. I would hope that voters will look at the performance of their leaders and judge them based on their actions, not based on their words. So to the extent that the voters in the United States believe that the president has anything to do with the scientific research and production of such a vaccine, they might be inclined to vote for him. So I would give much more credit to the American voter than just believing empty promises.
Mm-hmm. The economy, it's always been a major deciding factor in U.S. elections. I think it was James Carville, President Clinton's, chief strategist, who coined the phrase, it's the economy, stupid, which is really, it seems to be the deciding factor in many U.S. elections. The poor economy of the United States, stock market aside, the stock market has performed relatively well since March, since the March crash. But how might this poor economy contribute to the mental health of those in America? And from a psychological point of view, like how do you think it could affect the way they vote on November 3?
Losing your source of income and or being fired, being unemployed is well-established major risk factor for in mental health. Just remember the wave of suicides in the United States during the Big Depression. But I understand that political science research shows that in the United States, when local economy is doing poorly, voters have punished the president's party in presidential, in Senate, House, gubernatorial, and state legislative elections. So when a person suffers economic adversity, his or her scarce resources are spent on self-preservation of their own resources and on survival, and not so much on remote concerns like politics. So the question is also how the current economic crisis will affect the motivation to vote by those most affected. Right. People do vote according to what will help the overall economic situation, but it's called economic voting, I believe. What comes to my mind, though, is an interesting irony. The leaders of the United States and Israel are liberals as far as their economic policies are concerned. And recently, they've been forced to practice socialist policies by supporting the unemployed and the failing businesses with massive government funds. So again, this is something that needs to be done. It proves perhaps is something in favor of socialist ideas, but it may serve them well because they come as benefactors. So these are really unusual, extraordinary times we live in, and making predictions is very difficult.
Sure.
We're all perplexed.
You talk about the stimulus package that America did. You know, the Israeli government's been criticized quite forcefully for their lack of stimulus that they've provided to the economy over the past 8 months, small business owners being a part of that. How does that affect the psyche of the public, knowing that perhaps there's not a security net, or perhaps there's not a government that provides them the cushion to get through these very challenging times? Does it make an individual feel more alone or something along those lines?
Well, let me correct you. If I may, I think that the government was quite generous in the first round of support packages. However, we are now facing a much bigger crisis with a longer and more pervasive shutdown, and there will not be. There are no endless resources to pay as support packages. So people will be paid less and less. And I can sense and predict a rising sense of bitterness and dissatisfaction and concern about the quality of leadership during these trying times.
Fantastic. Dr. Zomer, thank you so much for these wonderful and compelling insights. We really appreciate it, and I'm sure all of our viewers do as well. We're now going to switch over to Dr. Israel Waismel-Manor. He's the senior lecturer in the University of Haifa School of Political Science. I will just remind our viewers in the audience that we will open this up for questions from the audience after this discussion, so please feel free to submit those at the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen if you want to ask Dr. Zomer or Dr. Waismel-Manor any questions at all. And if you think of a question an hour or two or three from now or tomorrow, please feel free to email info@asuh.org, and we'll make sure to pass them along to the respective professors. So Dr. Waismel-Manor, let's start by picking up a little bit where we ended with Dr. Zomer, if you don't mind. Do you feel like the existence or the promise of a vaccine by November 1st or any time before the US election could affect public opinion, voter turnout, and even voting behavior?
Well, thanks. It's really an interesting question, but the issue here is that it's very unlikely that, as Dr. Zomer said, that a vaccine like that would appear before election day. So perhaps I'll try and share some screens with you. I think it's going to be beneficial to just go over a few items here. So the interesting thing about having this vaccine is that people seem to understand that getting it rushed in before election day is probably not the best strategy. In fact, if you look at the data here on the left side, you'll see that while in May, about 3 in 4 Americans were willing to take the vaccine as it comes from the shelf immediately, now we're down to 1 in 2. And among Republicans, it's even less. So even the public in America seems to understand that rushing into such a production may force them to side effects or other dangers that they don't want to expose themselves to, as you can see on the right side. And those concerns are there and they are valid. And I would suspect that just having the news that perhaps the vaccine was approved by election day would be somewhat of a nice adding to President Trump's re-election campaign, but I don't think it's going to sway too many voters.
Can you outline for us your thoughts on how the pandemic will impact U.S. voting behavior in general? And to build on Dr. Zomer's response, how do you feel the stress of this lockdown, the reintegration and the reopening of the United States, in addition to the building concern of infection rate, how will that influence voter turnout and decision-making in this important election?
All right. Well, stress is not something that happens during pandemics. Stress is something that's inherent in politics. In fact, in my own studies of elections, we study stress during elections, and we find that people are stressed when they are voting, stressed of the public element of it, stressed about the fate of the nation, as you will, and those things do affect people. We actually, when people go and vote, we measure their cortisol. Cortisol is a hormone that is activated in situations like fight or flight. So for instance, if you are walking down the street and you see a lion, or God forbid, your mother-in-law, so your cortisol should be elevated and going up, and that gives you energy and an ability to run away or to defend yourself. So we see that elevation during elections themselves. And when you add to that component elections, we don't really know for certain, because there's no precedent like this election, of how it will affect eventual turnout. So let's look at 2016. 2016, we had a relatively high turnout of 55.5%, and people would like to participate definitely in this election. It seems like a critical election, but we don't know yet exactly if people, because of this stress, we know that stress causes people not to vote in general. So the stress about going in line with somebody who may have a coronavirus or may infect me, or somebody during the process of voting may infect me, may cause people to reconsider. One thing that's going to be definitely historical about this election is going to be the numbers of people who vote absentee or early or vote by mail. So if in the year 2004, the number of, or the percentage of people who voted by alternative methods was about 20%, it is expected that this coming election, we're not just going to pass the 2016 record of about 40% of the American public. It is estimated that about 60% of the American public is going to vote alternative, meaning that they're going to vote either by mail, they're going to either submit their ballots early, and that's going to be the way they are voting. So that's something that's going to be definitely groundbreaking.
Mm-hmm. To what extent do you think President Trump will be judged by his response to COVID-19? Do you think this might cause him to take a hit voting-wise?
Well, definitely, it doesn't help him. That's for sure. So the crisis doesn't help him. Usually in crises, when it's really close to the beginning of a crisis, you have this rally around the flag phenomena, but we are deep into the event already, and definitely it's not helping him. Let's look at just approvals. So you can see here the approval of President Trump starting from the early days of the crises forward, and as you can see in the graph, his approval is going down as we move along. Definitely it's not going to tank further much more because he has his base and supporters, but it's definitely taking a hit. But for sure, this is not something that will continue forever. And he would definitely pay for this. But as I said, with the base, certain people are not that affected by this crisis because they support Donald Trump and they assume as supporters of Donald Trump that it's not his fault. As Dr. Zomer said, it's the China virus. It's something that happened out there during his term. It's kind of like, I heard one of his advisors said this weekend that it's like Pearl Harbor. So it happened on his shift, but it's not his fault. And it's good that he's on the position of leading America away from this crisis. Obviously, people who are independent, and obviously for Democrats, they are much more likely to think that the crisis is to some degree his fault, and they're gonna punish him to some degree in our election day.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting, and that leads into the next question. It was one theory that was presented in the American Voter, which is, I believe, one of the most popular studies on U.S. voting behavior historically. But it asserts that really political campaigns very rarely convert voters from one party to another, very rarely. Do you agree with that assessment? Like, do political campaigns work to attract people from the other side across the aisle? And if so, does Biden's choice to be, a little less out there than President Trump over the last few months, does that, because of COVID-19, does that make sense to you? Is that a reasonable strategy for him to do?
All right, that's a lot to unpack. I'll try to go in the order you kind of presented it. So first of all, it's true that research has shown that very few voters are swayed in elections. And most people, as you can see actually in this graph, are already partisan. And they are in this era, it's even hyper-partisan. We are polarized, as in America today is more polarized than it was even during the Civil War. And that goes to show something. Most Americans would prefer their daughter or son to marry a Muslim than to marry somebody from the other party. So that is a testament of the spirit. Now, so those bases, the base of the Democratic Party and the base of the Republican Party are going to vote for their candidates regardless. But we have about 40% of the American people who define themselves as independents. And these people have no party loyalty, and they are more willing than others to switch parties if they deem the candidate coming to be somebody who's worth of their vote. And in that sense, it is possible to actually sway somewhat of the voters during elections. And the story that needs to be told is to try and switch people. For instance, we're looking here at President Trump's job approval, the average. So currently his job approval, it used to be worse a couple of weeks ago. It's somewhat improving, but still under 50%. So if Trump wants to bring these numbers up, what he needs to do is to just hammer one issue, and that's the economy. When it comes to the economy, the American public think that Trump knows what he's doing better than Biden will, and Trump is a businessman who has done well with the Dow Jones, with unemployment. Unemployment before the crisis was down significantly. The trend began both in Dow Jones and both with the unemployment began with the presidency of Obama around 2009, 2010. But the trend is continuous, and people say, okay, we're in good hands. We mentioned before pocketbook voting, people who are voting based on how much they have in their savings, their 401ks, their salaries, their employment status. So if Trump wants to win, he needs to hammer this message to the public. On the other hand, Biden has to come with a different message. And the message for Biden should be COVID. So Corona from dawn to dusk should be the issue that he hammers home. And he should make the case that while Trump always says that America is winning, that America is doing better than average, that he's going to make America great again, actually the only thing, according to Biden, that is going great for America is the great number of people who lost their lives, the great number of people who lost their occupation, the great number of people who are sick or lost their savings because they paid bills to recover from COVID-19. So if you can see here on the left side is the share of the population of the US versus the world, which is a tiny fraction of the US, of the total world population. But when you look at the number of sick people, of dead people across the world, America is winning, unfortunately. And that should be the message for Biden across this campaign. Now, you mentioned the issue of campaigning. So we're about 6 weeks before the election. We have the debates coming on this week, and we have the last effort to get out the vote, which is a main issue. So there are two ways you can actually win the election at this stage. One is to round your base. So these are efforts, we call them Get Out the Vote, GOTV, which means that you go to the people they kind of hinted support for you or surely are going to vote for you. And you just have to secure that actually on election day, which actually today is not just one day, it spreads. Voting already started in many states and it spreads across October. There's going to be many states that start voting. You need to assure that those people actually get off that couch, leave their homes and cast their vote, or they fill their ballots by mail and they mailed it in. So that's one thing you should do. The other thing is actually to bring new people in and those that are undecided. And the way to actually bring those people in is to try and frame the election around, as I said, around the issue that benefits your voting scheme. So if you're Trump, you want the media to cover from dawn to dusk. You want them to cover the economy, how many jobs were gained since the beginning of the crisis, and how people are doing better, the relief funds that people got, how much money they got from the government to help them recover. So that's one thing. So when they go and vote, or when they're filling their ballots already by mail, they're thinking, the economy is rebounding. Who's in charge of the economy? It's President Trump. President Trump is my friend, he's helping me. We're in good hands. I'm voting Republican. For Biden, it's going to be, again, hammering the story of deaths, of people sick, showing empathy. He's great with empathy because of his life story, being a widower, because of his losing his son to cancer a few years back. So if he's going to go with that story, many people are going to say, this year has been terrible, so much loss of life. And people, when they vote eventually, whenever that is, they're going to think Corona. If they vote and think Corona, that's the last thing they do before they vote, then Biden has a better chance of winning.
Mm-hmm. America's in the midst of what seems like several crises at the moment, right? We have a public health crisis, we have an economic crisis, an identity crisis, and many would argue an equality crisis in the United States. Once the election is over, do you see either Joe Biden or President Trump being able to help bridge this divide? Or do you expect this trend to continue regardless if Joe Biden or President Trump is elected?
The best predictor for future behavior is looking at past behavior. And I think if we look at these two individuals, they are two totally different individuals. And let's start with Trump. So Trump, in fact, is not that different from Obama. President Obama, when he took office, he rode on this almost kumbaya environment in which he said, there's no Black America, there's no white America, there's no blue America, there's no red America, there's the United States of America. But the moment he got into the White House, He worked on his policies. He had a majority of Democrats. He never reached to the other side of the aisle. He never tried to make a deal with the minority at the time, minority leader in the Senate, Mitch McConnell. In fact, he didn't even invite him to the White House for the first 100 days. So he showed them a cold shoulder, and he really tried to do his thing by himself. Trump is more or less the same. So Trump was elected as a businessman. He's not a person that is used to working in coalitions. He's a person who does his own thing, and he expects submission. He expects people in his hierarchy, in his business model, to submit to his will because he's the CEO. So the last 4 years were like that. He never tried to reach to the other side of the aisle. We saw it just this week with the passing of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, Judge Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and immediately he doesn't want to appoint somebody who's going to be kind of a middle of the ground judge like Chief Justice Roberts or Sandra Day O'Connor, the first female judge appointed by Ronald Reagan. He's not going for that. He's going for a right-winger judge because he wants to do his things his own way. Biden is completely an anomaly. You could say he's an anomaly because he's old. He's older, well, he's almost the age of Trump, but he's older much more than Obama. He comes from a generation of members of Congress, of senators who used to work in a bipartisanship manner. So people like the late John McCain, or for instance, Joe Lieberman. These are people that used to work together across the aisle, pass legislation regardless of party, thinking of what the best legislation could be and working around that legislation. So this is kind of like the era of the 70s, 80s of Congress. And being a product of that era, I think that Joe Biden could be much more than Obama for sure, and much more than Trump, could be that person who restores some kind of middle ground to America, which I think many Americans are striving, are eager to see that kind of a bipartisanship come back.
Yeah, I would agree. I would agree with you that I think a lot of Americans are hungry for that. You know, it seems like partisanship is such a force to be reckoned with these days. I'm curious to know, in your estimation, like when was the last time in U.S. politics that we had a good example of bipartisanship? It could be an administration or a president or even an era, but it seems like a lot of Americans are hungry to get back to that bipartisanship. But on the other hand, it seems like it's been a long time since we've seen a good example of bipartisanship. So I'm interested to know from you, like when would be the last example that you can really think of a true model of bipartisanship and working together?
Well, in terms of era, I would say that it died around 1994 or 1996. Electorally, I think it died in 1994 with the election of the new Republican majority guided by Speaker Newt Gingrich. He had a tremendous effect on this. He was a brilliant politician, and he brought this new cadre of Republicans who were not willing to play along with the bipartisanship. They wanted to take and conquer back America from the liberals and shift America back to more conservative attitudes. And so you could say that perhaps the last major legislation that was bipartisan to some degree was the reform of welfare passed by President Clinton with the much great assistance of Newt Gingrich and the Republicans. And actually, it was Clinton, Bill Clinton, who was the first president since Roosevelt that cut something from the New Deal. Reagan didn't touch the New Deal. He said many things against the New Deal, but he never touched it. Bush never did anything against the New Deal. Nixon didn't do anything against the New Deal. It was actually Bill Clinton with Newt Gingrich that cut social welfare programs. And if we go to kind of like perhaps the relic of something that kind of survived of bipartisanship, it was the McCain-Feingold bill to reform campaign finance, to have less corruption in government and more control of contributions, stop the power of big business, of big unions. Unfortunately, the Supreme Court ruled against that law, dismantling much of its provisions. And we can say that with it, much of the bipartisanship spirit died.
It's very interesting. Very interesting. Last question. The pandemic has been politicized across the US and arguably in other countries around the world as well. Who do you feel are the major demographic groups or states at play here that each candidate must secure in order to win?
Okay, in terms of demographics, I know that the media always loves to do analysis by groups. So if you get enough Latinos, if you get enough African Americans, if the Jewish vote will go for you. But it's kind of funny because for the same thing, you could say, oh, if all the redheads were to vote for Biden because they're Irish originally and they're Catholic, or if all, I don't know, the Teamsters, where there are 3.5 million Teamsters, drivers of trucks, there's 3.5 million Teamsters, and if only somebody would tell them how to vote, they could win the election. So it's a bit simplistic. True that there are certain demographics that tend to vote a certain way. So most American Jews, for instance, tend to vote Democratic unless they are conservative, unless they are Orthodox or ultra-Orthodox that tend to vote more Republican. Most Latinos vote Democratic unless they are very hardcore Catholic, and then there's a more tendency to vote Republican. If they are older generation of Cubans, they tend to vote more Republican. If they are new generation of Cubans, they may be more inclined to vote Democratic. So those are the key elements. But the best predictor, perhaps, to see the best measure to see where candidates are spending or believe that they can make a difference is to see where they put their money. And when you look at where the candidates right now are spending their money and putting their money, it's basically very few states. So there are about 14 states that are in play across the United States. But really, if you look at follow the money and you look at how much they're spending right now, 85% of all the money in the campaign right now is going to only 6 states of the 50 states in the United States. And those states are Florida, they're Pennsylvania, Michigan, North Carolina, Wisconsin, and Arizona. So those are the states. So those are the demographics. Those are the people that the campaign cares about. There's no, in America, unlike the Israeli system, where it's proportional, so every new voter gives you perhaps one more seat in the Knesset. In America, there's no reason to court voters in California if you're a Democrat, because you know that California is going to vote Democrat regardless. And also, if you're a Republican, there's no reason to go to California because you're going to lose regardless. The same with Utah. No Democrat would spend time in Utah because it usually votes around 70% for Republicans. And also Republicans don't spend a dime in Utah because they know it's going to be in their pocket regardless. So those 6 states are in play right now. Those are the states in which people are spending their money. Currently, Biden is leading with fundraising. Trump is in a better position with his ground game, has more volunteers. He has offices that have been working for the last 2 years in those states, unlike Biden, who started this process only a few months ago. So we'll see if manpower versus dollars, who is more effective at the end. But those are the states you should look at until November.
Yeah, it's fascinating. And I think we're in for quite an election and quite a whirlwind over these next, month and a half here. We're going to open it up for some questions from the audience, if that's okay. The first question that we got is actually for Dr. Somer. Dr. Zomer, a question from an audience member. Isolation being a prominent factor during the pandemic, obviously. And I know every individual has got to be different in the way they handle isolation, handle stress, handle anxiety, of course. But how long generally can someone go without being around others before it drastically affects their psyche, their work, their relationship? Is there like a general time frame that is like widely known among experts that it kind of people reach a little bit of a breaking point?
Here I am, because the screen of the slide is still being shared. Okay.
Stop sharing. Here we go.
Yeah, thank you. No, it's very difficult to quantify, the exact amount of time when isolation is going to start hurting psychologically. What is important to understand is that people vary and people are different in terms of the resources that they have. We all have different kind of resilience based on our childhood. We all have different trauma histories. We have different qualities of support systems around us. We all have different prior trauma or mental health issues. All these issues all these variables are relevant to the resilience of individuals. So generally speaking, I would say that the more intertwined one is with a community, the more healthy the emotional background is, the higher the likelihood it would be for that person to withstand isolation. But there's a limit to that as well, because we already know that, for example, the people who are isolated in the intensive care units, who are isolated because of their disease, are really suffering deep depression, and this is reported by the nursing staff. So this is the extreme case of isolation. So I would recommend to us all to think of our neighbors, our family members who are alone, of the older ones, the widows, the single people, and give them a call, because although we're isolated, we can communicate the same way we do now. We are now interacting, although we are thousands of miles away, and through telephone, through Zoom or Skype, we can offer support to people who are isolated to prevent a psychological breakdown.
Yeah, I think a very important point. Thank you. Dr. Waismel-Manor, in 2016, virtually every major poll said that the race was Hillary Clinton's to lose. Those polls were, of course, way off. But what do you make of the current polls now, many of whom say Biden is enjoying a lead in this race right now?
Well, I would just caution everybody, especially learning the lessons of 2016. But let me tell you just a little inside story here. In 2016, it's not that the liberal media got it wrong, that Nate Silver got it wrong. Everybody got it wrong. Trump got it wrong. So pollsters in the Trump campaign got it wrong. I was even speaking during the night of the election, so early evening America time, with a pollster who works for Hillary Clinton. And he has more or less the same numbers as the Republicans. And he says, I'm slightly optimistic that it's going to be for us. And I went to sleep for a couple of hours, and I woke up and I told him, so how's it looking? And he says, I don't believe in miracles. So by that time, you already figure it out that his numbers were way off, but everybody's numbers were off. Like Trump was preparing for delivering a concession speech, which is really hard for Trump to do something like that emotionally. This election, I think that people understood one of the major failures of the last polls was that they undersampled conservatives with no education. These are people that are harder to find. Pollsters usually give up on trying to find them because they work longer hours. Many of them don't carry their own cell phones to work. They are blue-collar people who have long days. It's hard to reach them. So this time they made a huge effort to actually locate these individuals, try to see how they're doing. And perhaps it's going to be beneficial to all of us that we're going to get a bit more accurate polls. But we really have to be cautious. Again, polls they shouldn't be used so much as a predictive tool. They should be used more to understand why people vote a certain way why an election went to this guy and not the other, and less as a cue ball or a crystal ball that predicts the future.
Yeah. You mentioned that Trump delivering a concession speech is something that many would find very difficult for him to do, which leads to the next
I said
question.
That for Trump, it would be difficult to concede.
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
And which leads to the next audience, leads to the next question from the audience, actually. The president has hinted, and perhaps some of his critics have asserted, that if he does lose in November, perhaps those results will be brought into question, and he might not leave the office so easily, I guess, for lack of better words. Is this even possible? I think a lot of people are wondering, is the transition of power something that we can mess with? And what would happen if he insists that the election was not legitimate?
Oh, that's wonderful. Well, it's terrible and wonderful in the same time. I just finished watching Hamilton like a couple of days ago, and when you think about it, America is the first time since the Greeks in which you had a peaceful transition of power from one individual to another, which in 1800 seemed like an amazing thing, that somebody loses, concedes, and says, well, good luck to you, I'm off, and even share the same residency since Adams and the White House. So in America, there used to be a tradition, at least tradition that began, I think in 1896, when William Jennings Bryan lost to McKinley. William Jennings Bryan sent him a telegraph, and he told him that the will of the people is law, and therefore he concedes and wishes them good luck. And since then, it's been a tradition that somebody, when he loses power, he concedes. Now it's a phone call, and they said, well, best of luck to you and good luck. Now, Trump hinted many times, including in an interview a couple of weeks with Chris Wallace at Fox News, that he may not accept the results of the election, that he will have to see. We'll have to see, as was said before, we'll have to see what's going to happen before I concede. The Constitution is a bit of a limbo, because the Constitution and the 12th Amendment is based on something that says, well, the presidency ends and the new president is to be sworn in on January 20th. But what will happen, for instance, if Trump comes to the same event, not just to cheer, but says, I came also to be sworn in because I don't recall that this election was unfair, it was rigged. And he's been playing that story at least for the last 2 years. He's been saying that, that elections are rigged. He's continuing that story from 2016. 2016, he claimed that he only lost to Hillary the popular vote by 2.8 million because 3 million illegal immigrants voted in 2016 with no shred of proof to support it. Now he's saying that there's lots of voter fraud in mails. Actually, a study done by Professor Levitt from Loyola University, a law professor, found only 45 cases of voter fraud in the last 20 years. So think about it, it's 1.5 billion people voted in those 20 years, 45 cases. Some of them, by the way, are fraud by Republicans, not just by Democrats. So it's not really an issue, but you can make it an issue that you can use it later on to, if you lose at the least worst scenario, just to save face and say, well, I'm not a loser, I never lost anything, this was rigged, but good luck to you, I'm going back to Trump Tower, best of luck.
That's right.
Yes.
Yeah, I just want to interject quickly. There's been a group of Yale psychiatrists who observed Trump for dozens of hours and concluded that he suffers from a malignant narcissistic personality disorder. If that is true, then it is impossible for him to lose. And I wonder what will happen if he does lose the election. It's going to be interesting.
Yeah, I hope we don't get to a point in which we have two people there fighting it off, as already they hinted that they may go fist to fist, mano a mano, at Biden said, I'll take you up in the behind the gym and I'll show you some respect. So I hope we don't get to that. We saw Donald Trump in the past in the WWE, wrestling. I hope we don't get to see two elderly individuals trying to kind of like squish into the position next to the Supreme Court justice to be sworn in.
Yeah, it certainly is an interesting time in American politics. There's no doubt about that. And we'll all be watching closely to see how this all plays out. I'd like to thank you both so much for joining us. It's been a pleasure. And I'm going to throw it back to Jen from ASUH for some closing remarks. Thank you both again very much.
Thank
you.
Thanks.
Thanks so much, everybody. Dr. Zomer, Dr. Waismel-Manor, thank you for providing a very insightful and thoughtful approach to a highly charged topic. It'll certainly be very interesting to see what the next few weeks bring, and we may have to check back with you following the US elections to see exactly where we land. Jake, thanks so much for moderating. For everyone, thank you so much for tuning in. If you have questions or would like more information about today's discussion or anything related to University of Haifa, please contact us at info@asguh.org. If you'd like to support any of the university's initiatives with the School of Social Work, the School of Political Science, or any other university faculties or programs, please visit www.asuh.org/donate. Thanks so much for joining us today. Be healthy and well, and we will look forward to seeing everyone soon.
Bye-bye.
Shana Tova. Good to hear.